The candles flickered against the polished wood of the long dining table, each flame bending to the rhythm of the night breeze that slipped through cracks in the shutters. The plantation house in Georgia was dressed in opulence, every corner heavy with wealth that had been wrung from sweat and blood. Crystal glasses reflected the dim light, silver forks clinked in patterns of careless indulgence, and laughter from the masters filled the room with a noise that was both hollow and cruel. Hannah stood at the threshold, her shadow stretched long across the polished floor, holding a tray that carried roasted meat and bread fresh from the oven. To any wondering eye, she appeared as she had always been, obedient, silent, invisible. Yet behind her still face, thoughts sharpened like hidden blades. Her body had been trained into stillness, her voice pressed into silence, but her mind burned with an intensity no chain could suppress. The masters laughed at their own jokes, spilling wine as though their cups could never be emptied, as though their bellies could never sour. The supper was a ritual of power, each bite a reminder of their dominion, each careless command to the enslaved staff a declaration that the world bent to their will. They did not see the tremor in Hannah's hand as she adjusted a plate, nor did they notice the way her eyes lingered a moment too long on their smiling mouths. She was a shadow, and they had long ceased to acknowledge shadows. What they could not know was that the table they feasted upon would soon transform into an altar, and their laughter would curdle into screams. The night pressed heavy against the walls of the house, suffocating in its silence beyond the lively dining room. Outside, the cotton fields lay ghost-like under the moonlight, vast seas of white that carried memories of back-breaking labor and endless cruelty. Every stalk of cottonseed made to hum with the voices of the countless who had bent their spines in servitude, voices muffled by the crack of the overseer's whip. For Hannah, each step she took inside that room was weighted with centuries of unspoken rage. She could smell the sweat of the fields even within the walls of the grand house, could feel the calluses on her hands even as she carried porcelain dishes. The laughter of her masters clashed with the silence of those fields, and in that clash burned the seed of her defiance. Her heart beat not with fear, but with resolve. She moved as if choreographed by destiny itself, her every gesture weaving into the spectacle of the feast. The meat was carved, the bread was broken, the wine was poured, and the masters basked in their own indulgence. They did not imagine the shadows could strike back, did not fathom that the very hands which served them could turn the banquet into their undoing. The house seemed to pulse with the rhythm of fate, the walls listening, the floorboards creaking, as though they knew the weight of what was to come. Even the air grew thick, clinging to every breath, pressing anticipation against the skin. Hannah's silence was no longer a submission but a weapon, her stillness the mask for a storm about to be unleashed. At the table, conversation meandered from idle gossip to cruel jokes about the enslaved, each word another cut against Hannah's spirit, yet each cut also sharpened her determination. She watched their hands tear bread apart with the same ease they tore families, watched their mouths spill laughter that had long been purchased through tears. Every smirk, every careless gesture was etched into her memory like a brand against flesh. Yet she remained poised, eyes lowered, voice absent. She poured wine into their cups with the precision of ritual, and as she set down each plate, it was as though she was laying the foundation of a reckoning centuries overdue. The very act of serving became transformed into an act of judgment. Her heart, heavy with grief and rage, found no release in tears. Instead, it carved itself into steel resolve. The room, with its golden candlelight and glistening silverware, seemed to Hannah like a stage, each player unaware of the tragedy about to unfold. The air grew denser, as though history itself was pressing its hands against the walls, demanding remembrance. Soon, the feast would be marked not by indulgence, but by screams, not by laughter, but by the rattling breath of men who believed themselves untouchable. The supper that bled was waiting, and Hannah was ready to write its first line in the language of vengeance. The fields of Georgia stretched like a white ocean, endless rows of cotton under the crushing heat of the southern sun. From a distance, the sight might appear pastoral, even serene, but up close it was a world of sweat, blood, and unyielding sorrow. Each stalk of cotton bore silent witness to the cruelty inflicted on those forced to pluck its fibers, their hands torn raw by brambles and thorns, their backs bent until the very shape of their bodies betrayed the weight of years in bondage. The overseer's whip cracked like lightning across the fields, a sound that cut deeper than flesh, embedding terror into the marrow of every enslaved man, woman, and child. Hannah's own days were often spent inside the big house, but her heart remained tethered to these fields, to the endless rhythm of chains clinking against dry earth, to the groans of exhaustion carried on the wind. The plantation was not merely a place of labor. It was a machine built from human suffering, grinding bone into wealth for those who feasted on stolen bread. In this world, silence became survival, obedience a mask worn to keep the lash at bay. Yet even as their bodies were broken, the enslaved carried within them something that could not be seized: memory, grief, and the smouldering ember of resistance. The land itself seemed complicit, its soil soaked with sweat and watered with tears. Every season carried the same cycle: planting, picking, punishment. The sun rose over the horizon like a cruel overseer, dragging shadows across the fields where men and women were forced to move in unison, their labor reduced to numbers, their existence tallied only in bales of cotton. Nights offered no reprieve, for chains clattered in the dark, and even sleep was haunted by dreams of freedom too dangerous to voice aloud. The masters viewed the fields as their kingdom, each acre proof of their wealth, each harvest a test, ament to their dominance. They saw not the broken bodies who made it possible, only the profits swelling their coffers. Yet beneath their gaze, beneath the weight of their boots, the enslaved carved out fragments of humanity in whispers, in songs sung low, in glances exchanged when overseers turned their backs. These fleeting sparks of life were quiet rebellions, fragile yet unextinguished, proof that even in the deepest shadow, light could persist. Hannah absorbed these fragments, each whisper and song etched into her being, reminding her that though the fields bound their bodies, they could not fully cage the will to endure. Still, the system pressed down with a cruelty so total that it threatened to erase even memory itself. Children were torn from mothers, sold as if they were cattle. Husbands and wives wrenched apart, their vows reduced to currency. Elders forced to labor until their bones gave way. Every cruelty was deliberate, every fracture calculated to sever hope before it could take root. The cotton fields were not only spaces of labor, but theaters of domination, where the masters rehearsed their supremacy daily. And yet, even in such a place, stories lingered. Tales of uprisings in distant lands, of those who had fled into the woods and vanished like ghosts, of souls who fought back in moments of desperate defiance. Hannah carried these stories within her as both burden and fuel, her own existence shaped by the endless tension between survival and resistance. When she walked among the rows of cotton, she felt not just the weight of her own body, but the accumulated sorrow of generations, pressing her into the earth, demanding that one day the silence be broken. It was in these fields, amid the suffocating cycle of labor and punishment, that the seed of vengeance found its soil, waiting for the day when Hannah's hands would no longer serve but strike. Inside the great house, the world shifted from the open cruelty of the fields to a quieter, more insidious domination. Hannah moved like a shadow across polished floors, her bare feet silent against wood imported from distant lands, her body framed against walls adorned with portraits of the very men who profited from her captivity. The air smelled of smoke from the kitchen hearth, mixed with perfumes drifting down from the mistress's chamber, each scent a reminder of the gulf between her servitude and their indulgence. She scrubbed, she polished, she served, always present, yet never acknowledged as human, a ghost employed to maintain the illusions of wealth and refinement. Every command hurled her way was delivered without glance or gratitude, as if plates cleaned themselves, garments repaired themselves, floors gleamed through magic alone. The children of the house tugged at her sleeves, calling her by no name but girl, even though she was a woman with a past, a mother once perhaps, a daughter certainly. But those truths had been stripped away by sales and separations, leaving her identity flattened into a role. Yet within that role, within the invisibility forced upon her, Hannah cultivated her most dangerous power. No one looked into her eyes long enough to see the fire flickering there. No one imagined that the silence they demanded from her could conceal such rage. She became an expert in moving unseen while standing in plain sight, a maid who listened, observed, remembered. The house was a theatre of hypocrisies. In the dining room, prayers of gratitude were spoken before meals, voices thanking heaven for bounty reaped from stolen toil. In the parlour, masters and mistresses spoke of honour and civility, while their words dripped with disdain for the very people who made their lives possible. Hannah heard every whisper, every careless remark, every cruel joke about the enslaved who were deemed lazy despite their endless labour, deemed ignorant while they were forbidden from learning letters. These hypocrisies carved themselves into her memory like scars across flesh, reminders of the lies that underpinned the entire edifice of plantation grandeur. At night, when silence settled over the house and shadows lengthened across the halls, she would sit by the dim glow of embers in the kitchen hearth and let her mind wander back to fragments of a past life. Perhaps she remembered her mother's voice, the lullabies hummed against the backdrop of sorrow, or perhaps the faint echo of laughter stolen from a younger age when she had not yet been claimed by another's ownership. These memories became treasures locked within her, smuggled across the years like contraband of the soul. In them, she found fragments of the person the system sought to erase, and through them, she nurtured her determination. Still, invisibility carried a price. Every day she endured insults unspoken, yet heavy, the way eyes glanced past her as though she were furniture rather than flesh, the way her very existence was acknowledged only when tasks went undone. To survive, she bowed her head, lowered her gaze, let the words wash over her without reply. Yet each silent nod was less a surrender than a concealment, each chore performed without protest less obedience than camouflage. Beneath the mask, her spirit did not bow. Instead, it hardened, becoming sharper, stronger, until her silence itself was a blade honed for the day it would strike. She began to notice things others missed. Where keys were left, which cupboards were locked, which herbs in the garden were used for healing, and which could be twisted into poison. She stored these details as a prisoner might collect scraps of stone from a cell wall, each fragment part of a plan too dangerous to speak aloud, but impossible to extinguish. While the masters thought her invisible, she was watching, memorizing, calculating. In the space between their laughter and their commands, she found her resolve. The shadows they forced her to inhabit became the cloak in which she prepared to write her story, not with words, but with actions that could never be erased. When the plantation house sank into silence, when the laughter of masters dwindled into snores and the lamps were snuffed out one by one, a different world stirred in the darkness. Hannah would sit by the embers of the kitchen fire, her body aching from the endless motions of servitude, her hands rough and swollen from scrubbing, lifting, and carrying. Yet it was in these stolen hours of the night that her spirit breathed most freely. Shadows stretched long across the floorboards, flickering with every crackle of dying flame. And in those shadows, her mind travelled to forbidden places. She imagined fields empty of overseers, nights not bound by orders, days shaped by her own will. The silence of night was thick, yet beneath it, she sometimes caught faint whispers, the low voices of other enslaved souls who had risked speaking truth after darkness fell. They spoke of rumours from far-off places, of revolts that had flared and been crushed, of fugitives who vanished into forests and swamps where dogs and hunters could not track them. These whispers were soft as breath, dangerous as fire. And though they disappeared with the dawn, they left embers smouldering in Hannah's chest. She was not alone in her thoughts of resistance, even if the rules of survival demanded that she bury them deep beneath masks of obedience when the sun returned. The smallest acts became seeds of defiance, invisible to the unseeing eyes of the masters, but potent to those forced into bondage. A look shared across a field, a song hummed low enough to escape notice, a prayer uttered not to the god of the oppressors, but to ancestors whose names still carried strength. These were gestures that reminded Hannah she lived not merely as property, but as a woman who remembered and endured. Some nights, when the wind carried voices from the quarters, she would hear fragments of melody rising like smoke into the darkness. The songs were coded messages, layered with meanings hidden beneath biblical words, songs that told of rivers crossed, of journeys taken, of hopes unbroken. Each note seemed to weave a tapestry of survival, a reminder that memory could not be whipped from the body, that dreams could not be sold on auction blocks. Hannah absorbed these songs into her marrow, letting them echo against the silence of her duties. With every whispered fragment, her resolve deepened, and with every whispered prayer she felt the invisible chain of shared suffering bind her not only to those alive, but to all who had walked this path before. She was part of a lineage of resistance, though unspoken, though hidden in silence. And in that realization, the night no longer seemed only a void. It became a crucible, a place where rage and hope fused into something sharp enough to pierce even the thickest darkness. Still, the risk of such whispers was immense. Punishment for even the hint of plotting was swift and merciless, carried out with a savagery meant to crush not only the offender but all who might dare follow. Hannah knew this with every fibre of her being, had seen the aftermath of those who had attempted escape or rebellion, their backs flayed open, their bodies hung as warnings, their names swallowed in silence. Fear was a weapon wielded as skillfully as the whip, and it pressed down on every soul in bondage. Yet fear, though it sought to suffocate, could not erase the hunger for freedom. For Hannah, the danger of speaking aloud was too great, but the danger of saying nothing at all felt heavier still, like a stone pressed into her chest. In the darkness, she whispered not to others but to herself, vows carved into air that no overseer could overhear. She swore that her silence would one day rupture, that her obedience was but a mask, that her hands, trained to serve, would not remain bound forever. These midnight vows lingered in the kitchen's dying embers, unseen, unheard, yet carrying a weight that grew with every passing day. The whispers in the night were more than talk. They were sparks, and Hannah, cloaked in shadows, was becoming tinder, waiting for the strike. The night of reckoning came wrapped in ordinary ritual, as though fate had disguised itself in silver platters and polished goblets. The house was alive with voices as masters and guests gathered for supper, their laughter spilling into the hallway, their hunger sharpened by the day's indulgent idleness. Hannah moved among them like a shadow stitched into the walls, her face calm, her hands steady as she carried trays from kitchen to table. The candles burned brighter than usual, their glow trembling against the glasses of red wine that shimmered like blood in the making. No one suspected. No one paused to consider that the servant before them carried more than roasted meat and bread. They saw only obedience, the familiar rhythm of service they had long taken for granted, never imagining that the feast set before them was laced with judgment. Hannah's heart thudded in her chest, but her steps remained measured, her body trained by years of silence to betray nothing. She laid the platters before her masters with the precision of ritual, her every motion choreographed into the performance they demanded of her. Yet beneath the mask of calm, something primal burned. A storm coiled within her veins, urging her forward. The feast began with prayers of gratitude, hollow words spilling from mouths that had never known hunger. mouths that had mocked the enslaved as they starved. Each prayer was another spark on the fuse Hannah had already lit. When the first bites were taken, when the masters leaned back in comfort and filled their mouths with poisoned bounty, the air itself seemed to shudder as history turned its gaze upon the room. The first signs were small, easily mistaken for trivial discomfort. A cough here, a tightening of the throat there, a hand pressing against the stomach with mild irritation. Conversation faltered only briefly before resuming in waves of laughter, but soon the laughter cracked into coughs, the coughs into groans, and the groans into a chorus of panic. Glasses toppled, spilling wine across the tablecloth like spilled blood, as bodies lurched in confusion and dread. The poison worked its way through them swiftly, invisible yet merciless, dragging their bodies into spasms of agony. Faces flushed, eyes widened, throats constricted as voices once raised in arrogance now gurgled with choking gasps. Chairs scraped violently against the floorboards as men tried to stand, their strength failing beneath them, their limbs heavy as though dragged by unseen chains. Women screamed, shrill cries cutting through the air before collapsing into retches of bile. The dining room, once filled with arrogant confidence, was transformed into a theatre of chaos, a grotesque inversion of the ritual they had repeated so many times before. And through it all, Hannah stood with steady hands, her face carved into calm, her silence no longer submission but judgment. The air reeked of sickness and fear, of bodies unraveling from within, of death creeping across the table like a guest uninvited yet unstoppable. For the first time she was not invisible. Their eyes turned toward her in terror and disbelief, as if searching for answers, as if realizing too late that the servant they had dismissed was the hand of their undoing. The house reverberated with the sounds of collapse, wood splintering as bodies fell, cries echoing against walls that had long concealed suffering, prayers muttered not in gratitude, but in desperate bargaining for life. Some crawled across the floor, clawing at rugs, leaving trails of vomit and blood as they reached for doors that would never open fast enough. Others tried to shout commands, their voices strangled into incoherence, their words drowned beneath the weight of their own dying. Hannah watched as the illusion of their power shattered before her eyes, each spasm stripping them of the dignity they had cloaked themselves in, each breath stolen by poison, a reminder that even masters could be unmade. She did not gloat, did not cry out. Her silence was heavier than screams, her stillness more piercing than any blade. The dining room, drenched in candlelight and shadow, became both execution chamber and altar, the place where centuries of blood and tears found sudden, violent expression. Hannah, once the shadow that served, now stood as the figure who judged, and though she knew the cost of this act would be unbearable, she also knew the silence had finally broken. The supper had bled, and no laughter could ever erase the sound of it. The night that had erupted in chaos did not end with the poisoned feast. It carried forward into the dawn like a wound that refused to close. Word of the supper spread through the plantation and beyond, carried on frantic whispers and trembling voices. What had been an act of defiance from one woman became, in the eyes of the masters, a plague of fear that could not be contained. Their world, once certain in its order, now trembled under the thought that obedience was not absolute, that servitude could be fractured by rebellion. The house, once a stage for their wealth, was transformed into a chamber of suspicion, its walls echoing with questions of who knew, who helped, who might dare to follow Hannah's path. The overseers, their whips eager, descended upon the enslaved with renewed savagery, lashing bodies not for crimes committed, but for the terror of crimes imagined. Hannah was seized in the frenzy, her body dragged from the kitchen where embers still smouldered, her wrists bound so tightly that blood rose to the surface of her skin. They wanted her alive, not for mercy, but for spectacle, for punishment delivered not in shadows, but in the full light of day, so that every enslaved soul could see the price of defiance. The punishment was not swift, it was deliberate, methodical, a performance crafted to restore dominance. Hannah was beaten until her back split into welts, her flesh torn in ribbons that bled into the dirt. She was dragged to the fields where the enslaved were forced to gather, their bodies trembling, their eyes cast downward, forbidden to show grief or rage. The masters' voices rose above the silence, declaring that rebellion would not be tolerated, that the poisoned feast was an abomination that would be cleansed through blood. They forced the enslaved to watch as Hannah was whipped again, each crack slicing not only her skin, but the spirits of those compelled to witness. Yet even as pain carved itself into her body, Hannah did not scream. Her silence became a defiance greater than words, her unbroken gaze a mirror, reflecting the cruelty of those who sought to destroy her. The masters called her wicked, ungrateful, a monster cloaked in the guise of servitude, yet in their fury there was also fear. They could not unsee the image of themselves choking at their own table, could not untangle the memory of their power undone by hands they deemed powerless. And so they struck harder, punishing not just Hannah, but all who bore her skin, all who carried her silence in their own. The final act of reckoning came not as justice, but as a warning. Hannah's body was broken before the eyes of the plantation, her life extinguished in a ritual of terror meant to stitch fear back into the seams of obedience. Her remains were displayed, her name cursed, her memory buried under threats designed to erase her from the mouths of the enslaved. Yet the silence that followed was not the silence of obedience, but the silence of mourning, of remembrance pressed deep into the marrow of those who saw. Her story was not spoken aloud, for speech could mean death, but it lived in glances, in prayers whispered into the soil, in songs altered to carry secret meanings. The masters believed they had crushed rebellion, that by destroying Hannah's body, they had erased her spirit. But spirits are not so easily broken. In the silence of the fields, in the quiet hum of voices at night, her act lingered like smoke that refused to dissipate. The reckoning they intended as a restoration of power became instead a haunting, an echo that reminded all who remained that the system could be wounded, that defiance was possible, that even a supper could bleed. The days that followed returned to their crushing rhythm, yet everything felt altered, as though the very air carried the weight of Hannah's absence. The overseer's whip still cracked, the sun still beat mercilessly upon bent backs, and the cotton still grew in endless white seas, demanding to be picked by hands that could not rest. But beneath the surface, beneath the mechanical motions of toil, there was a silence heavier than before, a silence thick with unspoken memory. The enslaved dared not mention her name, for even whispers could bring punishment, yet her presence lingered like a shadow that would not lift. Every row of cotton seemed to hum with her defiance, every chain clinked like an echo of her final stand. The masters strutted with louder voices, feigning unbroken confidence, but their eyes darted more often. Their hands trembled when they held their cups, as if the memory of poisoned wine still haunted their throats. The fields, which had always been prisons, now carried the strange duality of terror and possibility, terror in the renewed cruelty of masters determined to smother rebellion, and possibility in the knowledge that the system had been pierced once, that it could bleed again. The silence of the enslaved was not submission but survival. They learned to hold their grief deep within, to carry it in lowered gazes and weary steps, to bury it beneath hymns sung under their breath. Songs that once lifted spirits now took on heavier meanings, refrains bending into lamentations that masked remembrance as devotion. The masters heard only music toiling lips produced for comfort, but within the melodies were fragments of Hannah's story, smuggled through metaphor and hidden in rhythm. Even children too young to know the full scope of her defiance absorbed the atmosphere of mourning, the way adults stiffened when her name threatened to rise, the way eyes flickered toward the house with a mixture of dread and reverence. Fear was palpable. Punishments had intensified, patrols grew harsher, and the enslaved were reminded daily of the cost of rebellion. But fear is not the same as forgetting. In the stillness of night, when fields lay shrouded in moonlight, and the world seemed to pause its cruelty for a moment, there was a quiet communion among the enslaved, a shared knowing that Hannah had not vanished entirely. Her body was gone, but her act had become something larger, something untouchable. Years would pass, seasons would cycle, and the cotton would continue to grow, yet the silence of the fields remained charged, alive with memory, hidden beneath layers of enforced obedience. For the masters, silence meant victory, proof that their lash and their gallows had restored order. For the enslaved, silence meant preservation, a vow to keep Hannah alive in ways the masters could not detect. A gesture, a look, a verse sung differently, a prayer reshaped. These became vessels of remembrance. Her story transformed into something spectral, a ghost woven into the very fabric of labor, a haunting that refused to fade. The silence became both shield and sanctuary, protecting her memory from erasure, while carrying it forward to those who would one day hear it spoken aloud without fear. In this silence, Hannah did not die. She became part of the soil, part of the breath of those who still bent beneath the sun, part of the unseen force that whispered that even in the most suffocating darkness, a spark of defiance could still flare. The fields remained quiet to outside ears, but to those who listened with hearts burdened by chains, the silence thundered with her name. History has a way of burying the inconvenient, of silencing voices that disrupt the narrative of power, yet no soil is deep enough to erase a story born of blood. Hannah's supper of vengeance did not make it into the ledgers of planters or the official records of courts. It slipped between the lines of history where the enslaved were rarely granted space. But memory finds ways to survive where paper refuses. Hannah's defiance lived not in ink but in whispers, not in official accounts but in the trembling breath of those who dared to remember. Her story was carried in fragments, stitched into songs, folded into prayers, hidden in the marrow of those who survived the lash. The masters might have claimed victory by displaying her body and branding her name with condemnation, yet their cruelty only sharpened the outline of her rebellion. In their attempt to erase, they inadvertently immortalized her in silence, for silence, too, can become an archive. The echo of Hannah's act is not found in the words of those who enslaved her, but in the haunted glances of those who lived after, in the fear that shadowed every master's supper table, in the knowledge that even obedience could be weaponized against them. To place Hannah's story in its broader context is to see her not as an isolated spark, but as part of a larger constellation of resistance that lit the dark skies of slavery. Across the Americas, enslaved people carved pathways of defiance, through rebellion, through escape, through refusal to surrender their humanity. Hannah's act was one among countless others, yet its intimacy made it unforgettable. Rebellion not on the battlefield, but at the dining table, not with armies but with a servant's hand delivering plates. It struck at the very heart of the master's illusion, exposing the fragility of power built on domination. Hannah's supper of slaughter was not only a personal act of vengeance but a message, intentional or not, to all who heard. The enslaved were never truly silent, never fully broken, never devoid of agency. Her story echoes alongside those of Nat Turner, of the Maroons, of countless unnamed men and women who risked everything for the chance to reclaim a fragment of freedom. Each act of defiance was a stone thrown against the fortress of slavery, and while not every stone shattered the walls, together they weakened the edifice until it could no longer stand. In remembering Hannah today, we hear more than a single story. We hear the pulse of an entire history of resistance that has too often been muted. Her act forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, justice, and survival. Was her supper an act of vengeance, of justice, of desperation? Perhaps it was all three, blurred together in the heat of oppression. What matters is not the label but the echo, the way her story reminds us that beneath systems designed to crush humanity, sparks of defiance endure. Those echoes ask us what it means to honor her memory, not by softening it into legend, not by sanitizing it into something palatable, but by acknowledging its rawness, its brutality, its necessity. To hear Hannah's echo is to accept the weight of history as it is, bloodied and unvarnished, and to let it haunt us into remembering. For history's true danger is not that it is violent, but that it is forgotten. Hannah's supper must not be forgotten. The weight of Hannah's story does not rest in the past alone. It presses forward into the present, demanding to be carried by those who hear it. The silence that once shielded her memory from erasure has cracked open, allowing her defiance to step into the light of remembrance. To recall Hannah is to refuse the comfort of forgetting, to acknowledge that history is not merely dates and names but lived flesh, suffering endured, and choices made in impossible circumstances. Each retelling of her supper of blood challenges the narratives that paint enslaved people only as victims, reminding us that within chains there still burned will, agency, and the courage to strike back. Her story unsettles because it denies us easy resolutions. It forces us to look at the brutality of slavery and the brutal forms resistance sometimes had to take, and it dares us to ask ourselves how we would have borne such weight. By speaking her name aloud, we stitch her back into the fabric of history from which she was torn, and we shoulder the responsibility of carrying her forward. To remember Hannah is to accept a duty, one not confined to historians or scholars, but shared by all who engage with the echoes of the past. Memory is not passive. It is an act of justice. Each like, each comment, each subscription to the telling of her story is not a trivial gesture, but part of the chain that keeps her name alive, refusing to let it sink into the silence where so many others have been lost. When we press play on stories like hers, we do more than consume history. We participate in its continuation, ensuring that the lives once deemed disposable are restored with weight and meaning. Hannah's supper of vengeance reminds us that silence can be both a weapon and a shroud. Our task is to transform it into a voice. To keep her alive is to carry her into classrooms, conversations, and collective memory, to refuse the temptation to sanitize her story into something comfortable. We must speak of her rage and her act in full, for to soften them is to betray the truth of her resistance. The duty of memory is not only about looking back, but about shaping what lies ahead. Hannah's story is a warning against systems that dehumanize, against powers that claim permanence through domination. Her defiance, though crushed in her lifetime, lingers as proof that no system is unassailable. To carry her name is to take up the responsibility of vigilance in our own age, to recognize injustice where it festers, and to refuse the silence that allows it to endure. Her story asks us not to look away, not to dismiss, not to forget. It asks us to stand witness and to act. And so, as this tale closes, we turn to you, the listener, the watcher, the keeper of this echo. Carry Hannah with you. Keep her story alive in your mind, in your words, in your actions. Press the like, share your thoughts. Subscribe not just to a channel, but to the work of remembrance itself. For as long as her story is spoken, she has not been erased. As long as we remember, the silence of the fields cannot consume her. The duty of memory is ours now, and it is heavy, but it is necessary.